Morning. How we doing?
Awesome.
Great. So, I'm Rachel Appel. I work for JetBrains, a little company that makes developer tools. And welcome to It Works on My Machine, a phrase we've probably all heard, probably all said. So, this is next 50 minutes of what not to do ever. It's like, don't do this stuff. Train wrecks, fires, disasters, anything that is just awful and terrible that you should not do. And then some things that you could do instead. I think you'll easily identify these as what not to do. Massive failures. So I've been in this business for about 30 years now. And I've seen a lot. This also explains a lot. And it doesn't matter what company. Like every company has at least tiny dysfunctions and failures. And some of them are just completely like every department is dysfunction and failure. And you wonder how they even survive. So this is going to be a lot of that over the years, like crazy things that people think up in the software industry. And, of course, it all comes down to like, this does not work. Well, it works on my machine. It's that answer that you get. Well, it doesn't work anywhere else. So how helpful is that? Not much at all. So don't do these things. Right. It's all anonymized. Some of these companies are quite large and respected companies, like not by me, because I've contracted at these places. But some of them, I'm like, wow, this is like a major insurance company in the U.S. or a technology company for whom everyone in the room is using, or a hospital or something kind of important. And then even they have train wrecks, so this, right? But in software form and IT form. And some of the things that people think up are just, it's amazing. I mean, creativity points 1,000, but any other points like negative 1,000,000 for anything else. So we'll start in the back end, right? The funnest place of all. Database disasters. So I have a nice well of information from a single person on this one. So I worked on a project and a major automotive company in the US that decided to take normalized tables in SQL Server. And they said, this is not a good structure. What we should do is take a database table that looks something like this: ID, name, address, city, like columns, like you would normally do in a database. And they said, we don't want these pesky columns here. The SQL team recommends they don't. The SQL team recommends that we merge them into one column. Instead of, that's the face I made. Right? I was like, what? Do explain. Okay. So instead of multiple columns, we'll take all these, combine them into one, so that the fixed width of maybe 10 characters for an ID and another, it's the same painful expression. Yeah, I do it too, right? Address, city, state, zip, all of just so one column with fixed width text in it. And I'm like, so a text file, but in SQL Server. That's totally what they told you to do at Microsoft. It is. Yeah, I think you're full of it, dude. Right? But this person insisted. Let me tell you, I worked at Microsoft. The SQL team never said that to anybody, ever. Like, I can say this with confidence. So what happens when you do something like this? Bad things happen. That's what happens. So all of your stored procedures have to get rewritten, right? Which is great for job security for some poor person who now wants to kill themselves, right? Because this is all you're doing, right? Car index, pat index, trim, substring. And because of that, you can't have any more indexes, right? And remember, SQL is going to make a clustered index if you only have one column. So, it's a cluster. Right? So that's what happens. And then they said, gee, now that we've implemented this in our cataloging system, It's really slow. Really? You didn't see this coming. Okay. So don't do this. Right? If you see this, run. Like, get the hell out of there. Run. Because there is no nice way to get out of this once somebody absolutely ruins a database this way. You can, but it's painful, and they don't pay you enough. They just don't pay you enough to deal with that. But somebody actually thought this was a good idea. And I'm like, well, yeah, maybe in a text file, a tiny one that is not a database, for a tiny app, not a catalog. So that was one. Here's one of those columns. The column width was actually 20, but they only used 17 of them. And it did security. This was the security system for a web app that used this back end. So it was all yes or no, Y, N, N, Y, N, Y, N. So if I needed to know that a user from this particular customer group needed to access this resource, I would have to, in code, go and look like maybe 4 slots over to see if it was a Y or an N, and then return that and say whether or not they were allowed to access a resource. Because, computers don't come with built-in security or Active Directory or forms authentication or nowadays auth or any, sort of ways to do authentication. The only way to do this is to make a single column in a single table in SQL and put a security flag in for each. Now, as you might be thinking, well, I bet some of these columns didn't quite have 17. Some maybe only had 6. Yes, indeed. So sometimes you would get a null back, like an empty character, right? There's nothing in slot 10. Okay, nothing at index 10. What do we do with it? We don't know. Let's just throw an exception, right? A security flag exception. It's one they made up, right? So just security flag. What does that mean? We don't know. And then the users would say, well, we can't access this. It says security flag exception. What does that mean? We don't know. It means somebody did this. So again, not a good idea, right? Like, there's so many things that you can use that actually do security well that you don't need to half-ass it, basically. And do something like this. And none of this is a lie. I'm not making this up. I can't make this up. Who could make this up? Like, seriously. This was my life at one point. It explains a few things. So more. At a different project. Okay, this was a CTO. You see how some people climb the ladder. I don't know. Databases are just too slow. Sure. Let's just save it all in RAM instead. Do you know that RAM is not permanent? Yes, it is. I had that conversation with a CTO, Chief Technical Officer, right? Save it in RAM? Yes. I don't think this is a good idea. It's a great idea. Okay. So he directs his devs to store everything in memory because it's just going to stay there forever. We're never rebooting this machine, this Windows machine. Not Linux here, a Windows machine. We're never going to boot it. And he wanted 100 times 100 objects in memory. And I'm like, maybe that could be your problem. Right? Dealing with an object graph like that in a relational database. Maybe you should try an object database and maybe actually persist it at some point. Or this little thing that they have called caching kind of does that for you, but at some point does save it to the disk where you're not going to lose it when you don't reboot because you never reboot. All right. So yeah. And then I'm like, this is clearly one of those cases where somebody just kept getting promoted. And, they're like, oh, they're not competent. Let's keep promoting them. And then this is what happens. This is what happens. Yeah, so let's just save that in RAM. Yeah, good idea. So, to be fair, I was at a place that had a Novell server. Yeah, I'm that old. Running Novell. And it was one of those little servers that was actually in a closet the good old days. And they moved their office from this location to 2 blocks away. Fortunately, it was only 2 blocks away. And they forgot about the server. So they're like, oh, that system. We're missing something. And then they realize, oh, crap, we left the server back in the old office. And they said, okay. So they go to the server and they're like, yeah, problem number 2. Nobody has the password. We can't shut it down. And Novelia wouldn't have to shut it down. It's not Windows. Right? So then they go, well, what do we do? What do we do? It's connected to a UPS battery backup that has 15 minutes. Hurry it up. Put it on a trolley and run down the street with it still connected to the backup battery. Genius. Also, remember that password. Somebody got to keep it somewhere, just not on a Post-it note. So, yeah, so a couple gig of RAM for that one. Oh, at some point they would serialize stuff to a binary file and then save it. I forgot about this part. Because, yeah, I made that face too. So there's a lot of that face in here. So more databases. Here's a taxing agency in the U.S. So one of those kind of quasi-government, of course, government is a treasure trove for this one. How many stored procedures should you nest? Sometimes you have to, right? Just maybe 17, 23 more. Yeah, it's those. So I stopped counting between 17 and 23. And I'm like, at least they were consistent. They did this very consistently. And it was an outsourced project. And the C# part with the web app was actually quite nice, which is weird. You wouldn't expect this. And then we get to the database level, and I'm like, okay, so it slows down when the call, I'm running it through Profiler, it slows down at the database. Let's start looking at these procedures. Oh my God, they don't ever end. Right? So I'm like, this one calls this one. Oh, okay. Calls this one. Oh, okay, not what I would do. Calls this one. Right? And then after 3 hours, I'm like, this doesn't end. This does not end. And I'm like, I'm just done counting. This just has to stop, right? I don't even need to look at the code. When you're nesting 17 procedures, it has to stop. It's not maintainable, and this might be your performance problem as well. So there are things called joins in a database, in case you haven't heard the news. They've been around for a while. And you can just do that instead of doing it the Microsoft Access way of doing stored procedures, which is calling another one to hopefully return a little query and do that. Once in a while, you need to do it with 1 or 2, but 17, 20, we're getting a little ridiculous here, right? So this is all a whole hour of ridiculous in here, basically. Another good one. This is also, this is one of my favorite places. The people were so awesome. Dumbest posts. Awesome people, though. And what they did was it was another government agency, right, in the U.S. And they actually made some of the shells that tanks would fire, which is where it's pretty damn scary. They still had punch cards, right? And yet they're making stuff for tanks. America, right? So what they had to do was they had multiple SQL databases, and they needed to move data between the two. Oh, this is easy. I know what I would do. I would put those things in a stored procedure. And this was maybe SQL 2005 days. So I would maybe set up a SQL job to just run between them at a certain time at night, because that's what they needed to do, just nightly runs of moving your data around, edit, transform, load. Tons of tools to do that in SQL. Just after this, SQL Server Integration Services came out to help you do that as well. Those are the paths I would take. Nobody asked me about this, though. So what they did instead was they had their databases, and instead of just going between them, they set up a dedicated machine in a room and had multiple access databases. Here's your first problem. The minute I said the words access data, I know, right? Anyone who's done access is like, oh, God. Access databases that would pull down the data from one database. Now, if you've worked with access, you know the jet engine completely is shit. And it only will take down like 250 records before it goes, oh, I'm so tired. I can't do this. And it gets slow and clunky. So they had 4 access databases running like a little control panel, like they were on a Mars mission here or something. And like big ass buttons in the middle. Pull down this data, and all day, that's all it would do is just keep pulling down little bits of data as it could before access would blow up, which was at least twice a day. All right. And then they would push it back up. Oh, wrong way. They would push it back up to the other one. And then they said, wow, it seems like there should be an easier way. Really? I think so too. Like maybe a select into would work. Some of this, they didn't even need to do logic. They just needed to move it. I'm like, you didn't need this access database for that. And we're talking lots of data. And it got to the point to where this whole machine couldn't handle it. So they split them into 2 machines. So then it really looked like a Mars control panel of access databases. And that's all it did all day was clunk around. And then access would just get really upset over nothing. It's access. And it would just like bomb on a record or something and stop. And they would have to go and reset it like twice a day. Job security, I suppose, for somebody. Also, as a consultant, you make good money. Like if you have, well, first of all, you make enough money to pay for your psychologist to help you through the dealing with this. And if you can make enough money to not have to spend it all on the psychologist, there is good money in mopping up after this kind of stuff. So that's the back end. How about some code? So we'll start with comments. These are just fun comments. So not necessarily... Comments are fun. I say do them anyway. So that's just drop it on the floor. Eat me, I'm an exception. So somebody just does the try catch, and then we're not doing anything, which you should not do that. But the comment was funny. That's a classic. You're getting punched. That's my favorite. That's my favorite. Stop hammer time. I had a person who would put cheese all over the place in a code base. Just cheese. And then sometimes other developers would just put more cheese because nobody knew what this person meant. It was nothing about food. It was actually police and security protection systems. I'm like, what? Why is there the word cheese in this code? There's that. This one, should the following commented code even be commented? How meta. Please fill in this comment section. Somebody. This one, that was, I think Cheese Guy did this one about me. Drunk, that's another, that might have been me. And then this one, which seems quite serious at first. Yeah, you're like, oh, this seems like a valuable, oh, you shithead. Right? What did you do? So, yeah, rickrolled in the code. That is actually pretty clever, though. Of course, naming is hard, right? I like this one. If not stupid, save the file. And then Cheese Guy is back again with cheese and cracker. Like all through this code, I'm like, if the police that we're selling to ever see this code, we are so losing them as a customer. A lot of do-its and WTFs. So a lot of these things are, for a while I was very into this, detecting antipatterns, because that's what this is. To somebody out there who's high, it looks like a solution, but it's not. It results in dysfunction, so it's an antipattern instead of an actual programming pattern that helps us do things. So here's one that I found. A small company called me in and they said, well, we've been trying to adhere to solid principles, right? I'm like, yes, this is going to be nice code. I'm always so wrong about that. Okay, So you want to adhere to solid principles and we want to do it well. And I'm like, yeah, I love to hear that. And I get in there and they said, we're having a problem, we think, with this architectural element of code. It's really hard to manage the projects that we have. Okay, so I look in there and they were trying to implement, they got to the S in solid, so they didn't actually get far, right? The single responsibility principle, which says, basically, if you have a class, it should do one thing and do it well, right? And we're good, that's it. None of this Swiss Army knife, a class that saves a customer, works with an order, does inventory, no, that's 3 things at least, right? You just want it to be finely grained, right? Separation of concerns. So at least the desire was there this time. Usually it's just somebody comes up with crazy idea and we're done. So how did they try to implement this? Because they had a solution and they had 83 projects in a Visual Studio solution. Each project had one and only one class. And I'm like, well, I mean, that is one way to look at single responsibility. It's not how I would do it. I think you went a little over the edge with this one. You meant well. I get it. So it was a project and then one class file in it. And that, to be fair, that class did that one thing and it did it well. Except you can put more than one class in a project to logically group it. And that's where they just kind of cut the line and OCD'd it. Like they just totally went into OCD there. And I was like, well, this is actually not so hard to unarchitect and then put these into the proper logical. This is probably the easiest of all of these fixes. I said, it was kind of fun though. I said, okay, well, I guess it is SRP. You can't say it's not. Right? Technically. So, so good times with that one. Here's another one. I had fortunately, this was a smaller company. Also, sometimes I think this is Microsoft at the same time. I've seen more than one small company do this. We'll make one solution file in Visual Studio, and all of our projects go under that. Accounting's under there, customer stuff's under there, human resources is under there. I'm like, yeah, so when they say Visual Studio solution, they don't mean for your whole company necessarily. You can actually have multiple projects and multiple solutions for your company. The licensing model does not cut you off at one .sln. You can have more. Maybe we should do that. That was also kind of an easy fix. I'm like, here, we could just start new solutions and move some of these projects over because, they're like, we have to go in and compile each of these projects separately or it takes hours. Yeah. I'm like, well, I remember doing that in the days of DOS when things were slow and, 640K of RAM was good enough for anybody, says Bill Gates, right? Nowadays, we have more RAM. So that's another thing, projects and solutions. Sometimes the solution is not a solution at all in this case. Okay, here's a senior developer. Once I actually had to explain to a graduate of State University of New York what a function is. Comp sci graduate. Yeah, I was like, yeah, okay, a function. So here's what this person did. They had a web page and they had to print out a piece of data 4 times. Now, it's not the exact same piece of data. Maybe like one customer details here, another one in the second block, different customer, but it's the same stuff. Name, address, city, repeated. So how did they do this? Well, of course, the way we all would do it, right? They wrote the first block of code that produced the first item just fine. And then they just copied it and pasted and pasted and pasted and then changed it. All right, I could maybe not have a drinking problem if this was just one web page that they did this with, but they did this everywhere, all over a system that had these repeating elements like this. And so they just had this, instead of just saying, like they had individual blocks of code. And I said, did you know you can combine those into one function and then pass in the different data, and it will spit out that different data in the same way, here, 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 and here. And this person was completely blown away by this fact. I mean, completely blown away. And I'm like, comp sci degree, you say? Okay, then. So, and that's when I was like, American educational system. Okay, then. So, yeah. So functions are actually there for a purpose. I'm pretty sure everybody knew that one coming in the door. Unless you're that one unless you went to State University of New York. If you did, sorry, I think maybe you need some more classes. So yeah, that happened. And then that person somehow got into a senior developer role. Okay. Here's another. Oh, this was awful. So, in the days of web forms, actually, I don't need to say any more, do I? Web forms, ASP.NET web forms. We all remember this, right? Yay. Microsoft developers. So in web forms, the traditional model is you have this page called an ASPX page, right? And that's where a lot of people would, point and click and kind of draw some of the UI elements on. And then they would maybe respond to button clicks and write some code in another file with a .aspx and then either CS or VB extension. And that's called the code behind. And so they would have one file for like the UI and the HTML and markup kind of elements, and then one for the VB or C# code, right? And yeah, we could argue all day about whether that was the best practice over MVP. It was not. But, you could still get that to work in a nice and consistent manner. And I saw a lot of really good web forms apps that were built with consistency and using patterns. But out of the box, web forms kind of let you do probably things you shouldn't. So somebody thought, well, here's the genius idea I will come up with. How about I just rewrite ASP.NET without realizing that's what I'm trying to do, and I'll do it in ASP.NET using web forms, because what could possibly go wrong? So they created a web form.aspx that had one and only one control, and that was a content placeholder. So basically a span that just sat there and did nothing, and that was it. Now, where every other developer would have, drop downs or a form or whatever in here. Nope, we're too good for that here. We're just going to have this one control, because in the code behind, when I left, it was 120,000 lines of VB.NET. This is why I drink. Now, that whole single responsibility thing, they never heard of this, right? Because it was every responsibility. This was not even you couldn't even come up. Yes. And all the code did was you would always enter this page, and then they would pass a query string, right? That was just bigger than Canada. It was just huge. And they would actually hit the limit of how many characters you could pass in the query string. And then they'd say what? Why doesn't this work? Because literally you can't do it. Your computer is ticked at you. It just won't even play anymore. It's that bad, right? So 120,000 lines in one class. And all it was taking that placeholder and doing a placeholder.controls.add, manually adding them from the backend, which is what ASP.NET does in the background anyway when you use that model, the web forms model. So they would do that. So they would look at the query string, big if-thens, right? If this is in the query string, add these controls. If that's in the query string, add those controls. And this was database guy. So then some of this code would go back to that column with the Y's and the N's and have to check that security to see if it should produce some of those elements or allow access to this page. Yeah, and then he's like, look at this is how it should be. No, it shouldn't. Not even close. So, and I'm like, I don't even know where to start with this one. Like, can you come in and fix this? This runs a little slow. You don't say. Really? 120,000 lines. And this was actually small. This ended up getting much bigger. So after I checked myself into the asylum and had to take a break from this project, they just kept adding lines of code to it. Yeah. So that was good times indeed. So this was a particular one where I was on a contract and they said, at the end of the contract, we will offer a contract to hire, which they do that in the US. And I was like, there's no way I'm working for this company. Absolutely no way I am working in this group full time. Like 4 or 5 months here, we're good. So yeah. So this is like, just don't do that, right? First of all, we don't have to do web forms anymore. So there's that. You could use MVC. But you can use web forms to do perfectly acceptable work as long as it's nice and consistent and does not look like this, right? But yeah, that's definitely a what not to do. So especially with that database, that wonderful database behind it. So I don't know what comic this was from, but yeah, this has been many of my days, all day, for months on end. It's my sad existence. So we go from web forms to MVC because this is clearly so much better. No, it's not. They'll ruin it there too. So instead of MVC, what I like to call it is MVWTF because sometimes somebody goes there. So I had somebody. You have your client, and it would make a request. Instead of to a page, it goes to a controller, right? And we'll separate the concerns this way, and it'll be great. It'll be consistent and so much better than web forms. Maybe not. So what somebody did was they would take the request, it would come into a controller, and then they would write out anything that came in from an HTTP post, form data, to an XML file in the controller immediately. Also, that face, I made it too. Yep. Yeah, I was like, this caching. Surely it's because they need to cache it. No. Just when I think there's a little ray of hope. No. Okay, so they write to the XML file. Then they push down the view and then use Ajax to read that from a disk. What? And then send it back. Or actually it goes back and then they read it using Ajax. Some of it, they actually read it right on the server and rendered it. But some of it, they actually pushed down an empty page and Ajaxed it from the XML file. Yeah. Do you know there's an easier way, perhaps, to do this? Like, just, you don't need any of this. A controller, actually just a model in a view, like they tell you to do. In, like, if you go to docs.microsoft.com and you read my first MVC project, it shows you right in there how to do that, right? So you could accept in the controller, grab some data from the model, and just render it. You don't need to, and they were like, this is a bit slow. All these things result in, this is a bit slow, which means, oh my God, this is so slow, the machine is physically crying. It's a bit, you know why? Maybe from all these I/O operations. Do you know they might be expensive, right? That might take a while. No, don't they? Well, that CTO knows. He wants to put everything in memory. Ask him. He will tell you. So, this is also why I'm so sarcastic about everything. This is just a hilarious tweet from one of my friends. So it wasn't actually me, but found this in a Rails controller. In case you're not familiar with Rails or VB.NET, that is VB.NET code in web forms. It's fantastic. I know what somebody was doing with that. They were trying to move VB into Rails, right? I hope that's the way they were going with that one. But that's just pretty funny. So, also bug tracking. Nobody does this right. Right? A lot of places just don't have any bug tracking. A call comes in and they're like, developer, go fix that. Right? And the developer goes and fixes it. And then another call comes in and they'll go, other developer, go fix that. And they'll fix it, but not realize that they just overwrote what the last person fixed. And then another call comes in and they're like, oh, this sounds familiar. Developer, go fix that. And here it's the first person going, well, I thought I just did that. So I've seen that. So I call that who's on first from that old skit, just going around in a circle from Abbott and Costello. It's pretty good. Bug tracking. I've seen more bug tracking in Excel. First of all, like Excel, really. More bug tracking in Excel or on Post-it notes. Actually, I quite frankly just prefer Post-it notes at that point if you have to go that route. Guess what? They actually have these, developers have actually made these things called bug tracking systems. And when people call in with problems, they can log it in there. And then you could manage it. And then you could see somebody else fixed that bug. Perhaps I should not overwrite it and recreate it. Things like that. And you could kind of monitor the value of your product that way. It is an amazing invention. I know it's like totally brand new. It just came out yesterday, but they have this thing. Source code control is another one. Oh, people with source code control. So over the years, just source code fiascos. I remember going to a major electronics company that if you've ever owned an electronic device, you've probably owned one that this company has produced, right? Like a worldwide company. And they were using multiple source code control systems, except that they weren't. So what they did was, one group was working with, it was in the end days of Visual Source Safe. And so they're using that. And look, that's all we had at the time. I'll let them go, right? And, okay, before I could get them to even consider TFS, when that was starting to become a thing, all right, I said, okay, so at least you have source safe. What is your issue with this? And they said, well, you know, anytime a developer goes on vacation or quits or whatever, we lose data, we lose code. Really? Yeah, we think source safe is doing it. Okay, so I investigate. So what they would do is they would start a new project and they would check in everything initially, like just all blank items into source safe, and then immediately check them all out. So if there was me and say 5 other developers or 10 people working on it, each person would get a file that they worked on. Yeah, for the whole life of the project. And they would keep it checked out, and say the project lasted 2 months. They would keep it checked out for the 2 months and then check everything in. And I said, so essentially, you're not actually using source code control. Because they're not. Just because you originally put it in there and then immediately checked it out and you do nothing for 2 months, you're not using it. I said, why don't you just check in, like do daily check-ins? Like my mantra is check in early, check in often, right? Check it in, check it out, check it in, right? That's what it's for. And I said, but, if we check it out, or no, if I check my file in, someone else can edit it. You don't say! Really? Is that how that works? Would you believe me if I told you that's how it's supposed to work? And they're like, no, it's not. Yeah, I'm in a meeting like that. And they're like, but how do we stop people from doing that? Like their work? It's just, and I said, well, and what is this freak nonsense with you get a file to work on, like not a feature or make the app do this? Like, this is your file. And that's all, like, what is this about? And they're like, well, but that's how we get people to not be checking out other people's code. And I'm like, what do I even say to this? And so, okay, how about this? Why don't you bite the bullet, and I will give you a little plan here, right? So I'll get them to check in at least once a day, right? And this was this nerve-wracked them terribly to have to check in at the end of the day, right? So they would check stuff in and then immediately check it back out because someone else might get that file, right? And it was like a group culture. Somebody might work on their file. And I'm like, have you heard of the word team? Like, just asking, right? Because that might be how a team works. Just saying. They had a hard time. And sometimes, and then they would, so what would happen is if someone had the code checked out and they would like get hit by a bus, the proverbial developer bus, then they'd be like, ah, crap, we just lost all that code, because they wouldn't be able to get it back. And this happened multiple times. And that's why they called me in. And I'm like, well, all right, here's your choice. Either that's going to keep happening or you're going to listen to me. Take your pick. And they were like, oh, wow, this is tough. They were actually like, we're not sure what to do here. And I'm like, what do you say to this? Okay. So that was one. All right. I've seen copy and paste. So people just have a network share, take all my code locally and just paste it up there. And then the next day, just paste it up there. And then you have a copy of, like, you know how Windows names it that way. And then it's a whole directory of copy of a copy of a copy of. Or if they're really diligent, they would rename it. So you'd have like source 1, source 2, source 3. And then people would just randomly pick, like, oh, well, I remember that day is when I wrote that thing, so I'll take the one file out of there. Yeah, that's going to make it so much better. Just randomly pulling a file and using it. So stuff like that. I see that a lot. And I used to complain and I would say, no, so source control is better than none. Yeah, I take that back. Right? So sometimes there's just no good, nothing, not good. Another one. Yeah, this was the one. So if you do that, check it out, leave it checked out for a month because someone's going to steal your file, right? Probably an immigrant stealing your file, right? You don't get any history. And that's another thing. We would like to track the history of our changes. Imagine a system that might do this for you that's right under your nose that you won't use, right? So yeah, all these terrible things because we don't want to check in. There's a major insurance company in the U.S. If you have a mortgage in the U.S., you deal with this company. So be scared if you're from the U.S. And they had such problems with source code control and merging that they actually had to have a merge department with merge developers as a title. And I'm not lying. Don't give me that look. I am not lying. And merge engineers. And I'm like, if this isn't, I've created a artificial group just for job security, nothing is, right? And they actually had this. This is like the first and only time I ever saw this, and I never want to again. And it was because their source code was kind of dysfunctional. And then they kind of realized this is dysfunctional, but people got to move into these merge developer and merge engineer jobs. And now if we take it away, they won't have a job. Oh, but they will. There's actual stuff you could get done at this company, but they just didn't realize that. So politics got in the way of this one. They started out with a trunk, right? And this would be in TFS. And what they would do is, if there was a group of maybe 5 developers, and they actually called me in to work on MVC, which was not terribly written, which was surprising after I saw this. And their web form system was actually quite nice. And then I saw this, and I'm like, what? So they called me in, and I looked at this, and I'm like, okay, so I'll just, take a branch, and I'll work on my feature that I have. And so what they would do is do feature branching. Oh, okay, you're doing feature branching. But if I was working on 5 features, Instead of me just, checking out the stuff I need to work on and checking it in, they wanted me to make 5 of my own branches and work on one feature for each branch. And I'm like, is this like SRP for source control? You're not supposed to use that there. And then so not just me, but say you had 5 developers on a small team for this project, that's 25 branches. Oh, now you know why they have a merge department. So they would release on a month schedule because it literally took them a month to merge everything, all those branches from everybody. And I said, and they were like, so here's one of our problems. Maybe you could help us with this. And I'm like, why do people keep asking me to help them with this? So they're like, maybe you can help. Oh, okay. They said, so we're having a hard time getting our releases out the door faster than the competitor. They seem to have that down. And I'm like, I wonder why that is. Because it takes you a month to merge all of the work from the developers. And I'm like, this would be slightly less painful if they didn't, if they merge stuff, somebody else is merging your stuff for you, right? And then they would end up losing some of it sometimes. So little things wouldn't make it in, or they would overwrite something because they didn't do the development. And it was just bizarre and weird. So they had all these features, and they would have you try to roll it up into one, and then the merge people would try to tease that out and re-merge it. And I'm like, so you created the Department of Dysfunction, right? You call it the merge department. I will call it the Department of Dysfunction. You created this to deal with a disaster that you created that is slowing you down actually from getting to market. And now you're kind of wondering why the competitor is getting there first. You know why? Because maybe they don't do this over there. Just going to throw it out there. Maybe that's why. So I was like, look, source code control is really not my funnest thing to work on. I'm an ASP.NET person. So I got an ALM ranger to go in there, and he was like, oh, what did you get me into? And I'm like, I love you, that's why. So yeah, people do stuff like that. Yeah, so when you need a whole department just to merge your stuff, yeah, it's that bad. Standards, nobody knows what these are. Move along. Testing's another, just a treasure trove of nonsense, right? I see people who, we're going to test. Testing, unit tests. And then they go, oh, crap, they're red. I know how to solve this. We'll just comment everything out and return a pass. Yeah. Hey, I'll tell you what, it's really fast. The tests run super fast when you do that. And then you're like, hey, I got this code coverage report, and it's also 100%. We're so good. I've seen it. Yep. Architecture. This is the Winchester Mystery House in California. This crazy lady that was like tremendously wealthy, but nuts, thought that spirits and demons were following her around. And so she built a mansion that is now a tourist site. I think 1800s or something like that. And stuff with like this, a door to nowhere. If you step out this door, pew, you go down a few floors, and there's like staircases where you could drop through them, and you get locked in rooms, and bookcases that slide and let you pass through, and booby traps and all kind of crazy stuff for crazy lady and her cats. I say it was probably the cats, probably not demons. Well, cats kind of are demons, but that's different. So I see software just like this. This whole talk has been software that is just like this house. But one of the things I saw with like service-oriented architecture is, here's a classic model. Oh, wait, first, before we get to the classic model, here's another what not to do. This is an actual diagram, database diagram, right? And here's what I'm going to say about this. That was all that the customer really needed. Yet, they decided to implement all of the other stuff. So there's this concept called YAGNI, or you ain't gonna need it. So don't implement it. You don't need that either. Throw that out. So think about things. If you don't need them, don't add them in. Or you get stuff like this. So I see a lot of diagrams like that. Queuing can often be another one of these kind of YAGNI solutions, or unsolution. So for developing highly connected systems where you have good networks, you probably don't need a queue. Now in the cloud makes things a little bit easier, but we're talking like message queue. That thing, yeah. So a classic architecture might be this. Client hits maybe a B2B website or even a consumer site, and that site might either just go through a web service or even directly hit the database. Well, that's pretty standard, right? Standard web app. Okay, a small architecture, we don't need a lot, just, nothing terribly fancy, just a regular website where you can buy a few things. And a website that could have been architected this way was not. It was architected this way. The website, which called on a web service. Okay, there was a little bit of logic in the web service. Now, web service put stuff on a queue for no reason, because it was in a highly connected local area network at this point, okay? And then a second web service would pull stuff off the queue and run the same logic as the first web service, and then it would do a security check. And guess where it did it? Back at that column with the YNNY. So not only did they wait until the very end, but then they did stuff like that. So I see actually this red box is stuff you don't need. Possibly even this. They actually definitely didn't need the stuff in the red. They actually didn't even need that web service anyway, because when it got to the database, that same logic again ran in a stored procedure. So at least it was thoroughly checked. I mean, there's that. 3 times the same code running, basically. So yeah, a little bonus security in the web service. For UX, this is a mock-up of an actual app. That was the color scheme. And I had to mimic out some of the fields, but yeah, that was the actual color. These are bad colors, I'm just going to say. I don't think you need to be an artiste for that. Don't do this for your phone number. People could type in their phone number just fine. Don't do this. I don't even know what to say to do. Just don't do that. This is also, no, don't. What the? I don't even know what that's supposed to be. This is just hilarious. America. Okay, government, again, this is the US's healthcare.gov. This is our healthcare system. That's not even programming, it's just hilarious. Just what? Probably not a good idea. No. Hey, but they're not a robot. Okay. I don't even know what this means. It's a bot. Perhaps we should do some more training on the bots. That could be misinterpreted, I think. Also, if you have to put a "where do I sign in" staples, that easy button is not working. Here's another one. I'll actually run this. This is a mock-up of a major insurance company in the US. I didn't put any words on it, but this is what it looked like. They said, "We're having performance problems. What can we do?" Okay, let me see your app. It was a Windows Forms app. And, okay, so they had tabs. Okay. Okay, some more tabs. Wait a minute. Wait. Stop. Wait, are you kidding me? And they did go all the way across. And this was generally full screen, too. But, yeah, keep going. Yeah, keep going. They did. 5 levels down, and then I'm like, oh, okay, we're done. No, we're not. No, we're not. And this is what it looked like. And they deployed it to a central server and wanted people to VPN in and run it. And like 3 people would log in and it would just go. And they said, we have no idea why this is happening. And I'm like, you don't? Really? Stand back and take a look again. You have no idea why that's bombing. And it won't even run. Really? So, okay then. We're good. But that's, what it looked like. Anonymized. But that's... And then I'm like, what? How complex is insurance? And I'm like, they have these things called menus. Just a suggestion. So that was tabs. So good user interfaces are just anything you did not see in here, right? Don't confuse people. Make color meaningful. If you physically hurt somebody's eyes, you're doing it wrong, right? Don't confuse them. Make it consistent. It's important to users. So even if you're not a UX person, I don't think of myself as one. It's important to us. If people don't use it, your product's crap, right? So, and then the last little bit, you get recruiters. They're, consultants, I told you about the Novell thing before. Consultants do that. I call it the poop and swoop, or the swoop and poop. They come in, they poop on stuff and fly away. Right? That's a consultant. Right? Or a classic Dilbert, conning and insulting. Right? Doesn't it seem like that's what they do? Right? And recruiters do things like 10 years of Node, a year after it's released. I get asked if I know C#, like 3 times a year at least. No, I don't do C#. I don't do F# either. They don't know what SQL is, right? And they think Java and JavaScript is the same, right? Can you do the Java or the script part of it? Yeah, real good. And then after I see all this, I get on an airplane and fly here. One that software developer. So what does this say even about me, right? I actually get on a plane and come here, knowing that software developers wrote the software for it. So there's a lot more, but I think this is enough. We had enough disaster for today. So thank you for coming.